Well, we're excited to be here. This is not a topic that Maren and I speak a lot about, so you're going to get a little extra raw and unfiltered. So buckle up. Let's go for it. Just out of curiosity, show of hands, who's married in the room? Okay. Anybody that's engaged in this room?
Yeah.
Okay, we got some couples holding hands. That's not going to last for very long. No. I'm just kidding.
Jeremy and I hiked up Rattlesnake Ridge holding hands the entire way.
Yeah.
One time.
Once, yeah. That only happened once.
The whole time.
That's right.
That was like our third date.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're moving fast and furious. Who's dating in this room? Are we about to create some DTRs? Are we dating? We're like, I'm seeing some awkward looks to the side here. What are we? Okay. Who's single?
All right.
All right. Is there anyone that's dating that's about to be single? Yeah. Maybe by the end of this talk, we'll just go for it. All right. Well, that's helpful. So we're gonna cover some ground. Some of what we'll cover is theological. Some of what we'll cover is practical. And obviously, as followers of Jesus, there's a lot of space where it's sort of gray in between theology and how and where we put that into practice. Like the Bible doesn't give us a playbook, unfortunately, for how to navigate the modern era of dating. Like, there's nothing about online dating in the Bible and how to navigate that effectively. And so there's a lot of areas where we have to exercise discernment and freedom as followers of Jesus. But we're coming at it first and foremost through that lens of followers of Jesus, trying to discern what is God's best for us. What does the Bible tell us? What is God's best for us? And then how do we navigate a culture that, if we're honest, has pretty much screwed up most of relationships and marriage? Like what culture is offering us is not working. I don't know anybody that would say like the cultural kind of view of marriage and relationship is creating human flourishing and thriving families. We don't have to look far to be like, okay, well, we have some ideas of what it's not. So we want to kind of navigate some of that and offer a little bit of a different perspective.
Yeah, and the truth of the matter is, I'm sure there are some of you here tonight who maybe don't have a biblical worldview, and we're so thankful that you are here. We did just want to give the caveat that we are coming from a worldview of faith, but regardless of whether you have a faith background, you are entering into an idea of marriage and engagement with some sort of worldview, some sort of framework. And so we just wanted to lay out a simple way to think about it in ways that are hopefully applicable to everyone in the room.
And then you'll get to hear later tonight, we've got some folks from the Marriage Mentor team here also, and there's sort of a ministry that Reach has. And one of the interesting things, so you heard Maren and I have been married for 15 years. One of the phenomenons in life growing up, I don't know if any of you have had an area of this. Like for me, there was a point when I became a parent. We have 3 kids, 11 and 10 and 8. When you're a kid, and especially if you have a parent that's like a fairly high-functioning parent, you tend to think as a kid that your parents or maybe your teachers like have it all figured out. And then you become a teacher or you become a parent and you're like, oh no, like they had no idea what they were doing. And I don't either. We're all figuring this out as we go. The same thing is true in marriage, right? Like if you see someone that's like, oh, they've been married 15 years, like, oh, I bet they have blank figured out. And then you think, oh, somebody who's married 30 years. And I think what I've seen over the years, one is I don't know of any area where you reach the point where you're like, dun 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 dun, like I've got it all figured out. Wow, that's what it feels like. That's what it feels like when the light bulb goes on. I think relationships are that same way. And the marriages that I admire the most are the ones where I have a mentor that has been married for over 50 years, and I've spent time with he and his wife, and they're still learning. And I'll talk to him, and he'll be like, yeah, I'm learning that I can be a better husband through blank. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. 50 years in, you're still learning how to be a better husband. And so we're certainly not coming from the place of having arrived at having this all figured out.
And hopefully that's exciting to you. Like, I think it's exciting. If I knew everything there was to know about marriage and or Jeremy, I think that would be pretty dull. So it's exciting. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. We're gonna get into it.
You heard in our story, and we want to just cover a couple of little highlights. We met in our mid-20s. I was 26 and Maren was 24. So depending on your culture and context, like some people think that's really old because some, in like certain church communities, people get married real young. And then from a worldly standpoint, that's super young. Like that's way below the average. So we were kind of in that, 24 to 26. And as you heard, we got engaged 9 months, like to the day after we met, and married 5 months after that. So relatively quick. And it was an amazing journey. And part of that was because there was an imminent move overseas. And so that sort of forced us to dive into like conversations, like where are we going? And what is this going to look like? But part of the advantage that we had out of the shoots that was mentioned in the intro is we got set up by mutual friends. And for us, that was actually really instrumental. I'm a huge believer in community. In fact, I would submit that's probably why you're here. And if you didn't know that's why you're here, that's probably what drew you. Somebody invited you, something about being around like-minded people who have similar interests, who are committed to living similar values. And so we were fortunate in that we had a husband and wife couple that knew us both, that introduced us. And that was, I think, especially unique in that both of us had attempts at being set up before, and oftentimes if it was like just the dude, like some of my dude friends did not have great discernment when they were trying to set me up. But then the flip side is I had, some people where it's like the woman is like, oh, I have this amazing friend and she's fantastic, and the husband's in the background like, don't do it, And this was like one of the first times where both of them, to both of us, were like, man, here's the guy's take, here's the woman's take, and this is why we think you guys should meet. And so we came in with this sort of resounding endorsement of who the other person was that carried a ton of weight.
Yeah, and then we quickly transitioned. So pre-dating, engagement, pre-marriage was very much in a context of community. And then, as Jeremy mentioned, we hustled off to England for our first year of marriage without any community. And so, there were some challenges navigating, as you can imagine, identity, all of those things, that transition, living outside of the country, outside of all of the things that felt somewhat normal. But it was also a really beautiful time because we developed some healthy habits early on that might have taken years for us to cultivate. Just learning how to go to each other, because I think as independent single people, your tendency is to call your best friend or to call your mom or whatever. And even like to go to God alone. And I think it just forced us to come together. We lived in what we called the high five studio, the high five flat, because we lived, it was, if you sat on the end of the bed, you could high five somebody at the kitchen counter, at the table, and at the toilet. So it was our high five flat. It was magical and wonderful and challenging, but a really beautiful way to begin marriage. And so within the context of community, outside of the context of community, we also built some really wonderful habits going to each other.
Yeah, and so one of the reasons why I think community and places like this are so important is some of the most important information that in the process of like from dating to engagement to marriage, like some of the most important questions you will ask and the most important things you will wrestle with, I think you can really only wrestle through effectively in the context of community. Like if you're trying to size somebody up that's a perfect stranger with no other perspective, even from an employer standpoint, if any of you have ever like hired somebody and like if you were trying to do that with no resume context, no references, no outside information to be like, okay, I'm just going to spend some time and see that community is, and especially multi-generational community of men and women committed to living similar values and principles is such a powerful way to get to know another person and to discover who they are and who you are, and surrounded by a group of people who are committed to helping draw out God's best in you and God's best in that other person. That so much of that journey is discovering like, okay, who has God created me to be and called me to be? And how does that align with who God's created you to be and called you to be? And how are we on that journey together? And so, yeah, the community piece for us was massive there.
Yep, so we had our blissful year of our extended engagement, honeymoon period, or not engagement, honeymoon in Oxford, and then we moved back. We've launched Atlas Free. We've been involved at Reach, and we had a few children. Our youngest is 8, which feels very old. But yeah, that's kind of our story that we've been on, and now we're 15 years in.
Yeah, so I think what we're going to do is talk through. We want to leave plenty of time for Q&A and some discussion, but we had a few thoughts to just kind of talk through some of the framework that I think could be helpful of just sort of elements of like how we view marriage, because marriage is talked a lot about in society, and so we kind of wanted to zoom out and just talk through sort of three different lenses of what is marriage, what's the role of marriage. And so we'll kind of hit on these three areas and unpack them and kind of riff off of each other a little bit and then see where the night takes us. So the first one we want to talk about is marriage is practical. I think this is actually one of the pieces that isn't talked a lot about, but we're a little bit unique in like modern history of a different view of marriage for almost all of history, all of human history, that for most generations historically, and still true in most or many parts of the world, that marriage is first and foremost, and sometimes almost exclusively practical, in that like you need a teammate and a partner to do life with, to exist and to survive. When you think about the percentage of the world's population that still lives below the poverty line, or that, you know, that still lives from day to day, like marriage is a teamwork exercise, and it has been for most of human history. The idea that it's deeply, deeply practical and necessary. It was key for survival. Even modern day tax codes, like if you think about like, well, why are there tax benefits for being married? Well, the reality is like marriage and the family has been the backbone of civilization. That all the sociologists would agree that like if human flourishing comes when children have their parents in the picture. That's not like a religious statement, that's just a sociological proven fact that every social scientist that studied like social constructs would agree that like the pathway to human flourishing is the family unit as the baseline institution. And so even governments put tax laws and financial incentives in place in society to say, how do we optimize for human flourishing in social constructs? And the backbone of that is marriage. And that relationship. And so that's like a starting point to say, even before you get into like the chemistry of marriage and the spirituality of marriage, is that marriage on one hand is a deeply practical social institution that has existed since the dawn of time in a sense of couples being committed together to raise a family, to function as the baseline institution of society. For me, one of the ways that this was sort of hit home, my grandparents were Depression era. My grandpa was Purple Heart in World War II, born into the Depression, was the second youngest of 17 kids, had multiple siblings that died of various plagues and diseases. And this is like here, he grew up on Vashon Island, right? But like, this is not that long. This is my grandpa. Like this is, and yet it sounds like prehistoric, right? And like, but not like the Great Depression and World War II. Like that generation, by and large, was thinking about like, how do we survive? And I remember at times my sister and I even asking like my grandparents about their relationship and like, what things like bring you joy? And they're kind of like, huh? Like what? Like it was so much about survival. And I remember after my grandpa passed away, my grandma showed me this note, and she would cry every time she read it, of like, your grandpa gave me this note. And I was like, can I read it? And she pulls it out, and it's like 3 lines. And it says, Shirley, you have wonderful penmanship. You're a great housekeeper, and I'm grateful you're my wife. And that, like, she treasured that thing. But honestly, that captures a lot of their relationship. Like, they were teammates that were married for like over a half a century, and they loved each other, and they were fiercely loyal, but they didn't like sit in the moonlight batting eyes at each other, listening to Kenny G and reading poetry. Like they were teammates that like believed they had a beautiful life, that raised that they raised their kids together. They took trips together. They went square dancing. They did activities, but like they didn't move much into that. Like, does this person satisfy your deeper longings? If you asked them that, they'd literally be like, rephrase the question, right? Like, I don't get it. Like we've had a great life. We work well together. We make, we have different roles that we play. We function well. She has wonderful penmanship. Like it was just, that was the world they lived in, but that was the society that they grew up in the Depression era, where you needed a partner to survive. Like good luck trying to raise, there wasn't the welfare state where the government's just going to swoop in and pay all the bills and, if they can't afford this, it's like you stick together or you don't make it. And they had seen it. Like their parents had to do that, and they were losing kids. Kids were dying off. and they had to fight for survival. And so that, in a way, I think it's important to understand that that's the foundation, to realize that for most of human history, people have been making them marriages work out of raw, sheer grit and determination to be better partners together than you are alone. And to know that somehow the world is better if we stick together and fight for this. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that matters. Like, we want to obviously move into the relational element. But I think when you understand that, like, we're actually one of the few generations and one of the few times in history where that's the luxury through which we've been able to engage this conversation, I think it's helpful to know that, like, oh, there's a gear that humans have to make relationships work from a place of grit and determination, and like, we're going to survive and we're going to be better humans for it because of our commitment to each other. That's sort of within us all, because humans did it for millennia. And things have changed in the last 50 years, but we have that same like capacity to be incredible, determined, like gritty, survive, like humans that can survive together, better together than we can alone.
Yeah, and if you even look at when God created woman, he was looking around all of creation after he had created Adam, and he didn't find a helper suitable for him. And even the language used in the Bible, that idea of a helper, a teammate, a helpmate, indicates our God is a God of order. He wants to create structure. He wants to create a life, a structure that we can thrive in, that is for our good. And that's, I think sometimes we can tend to over-spiritualize things and forget that he's also very practical. He wants us to flourish. And even you think about all the laws listed out in the Old Testament, you're like, gosh, why all this? It just seems so unnecessary. But he was looking out for his people. He wanted to set them apart, and he wanted them to flourish. I even am thinking about the verse in Ecclesiastes that talks about a cord of three strands is not easily broken. And I think we often think of that as like, oh, that's such a beautiful, romantic symbol. And it's like, no, it's actually just really strong. Like, that rope is not going to break. And so it's practical. You are going to be better together than you are apart. You're going to accomplish more than you could on your own. That idea of synergy, it's just practical. So marriage is practical. That's number one. But we're going to get into some really good stuff too, because marriage is also relational. Yep, there it is. So when you think, this is, I think, what oftentimes people think about is the romantic chemistry, and even the friendship, companionship piece is a huge part of marriage. It's a beautiful, wonderful, fun, wild part of marriage. And one thing that has been really sweet for us in our marriage is to just figure out how to be better friends to one another. And even the other day, we were talking about a friend who was kind of reflecting on, if my wife was asking me for help with something and I was feeling really resentful about it, but if my friend asked me, hey, buddy, I need help with moving this big piece of furniture, I would be there in a heartbeat. And so how can we be good friends to each other? I think a lot of times, even with scripture, we can kind of parse out like, this is the passage that talks about marriage, and this is the passage for everybody else. And we forget that actually all of this is essential and necessary to also apply within a marriage context. And so I just laugh, like, if people talk about the verses about, what about the wives submitting to the husbands? And, we just don't like that word. But it's you're taking it out of the context of the broader themes of just serving one another and being in relationship with one another. And so I think that just when you are in relationship, you're building into a friendship. This sounds cliche, but trust and communication are like top two ways that. And I think this is so widely applicable in all relationships. But I think something in marriage specifically, that idea of trust is built because you have committed to this person for a lifetime. And so there is a freedom in that because you feel like you can be your more vulnerable, authentic self because this person has committed to continue showing up. But I also think that there are really helpful, proactive ways that you can explore that with each other. And to just kind of ask yourself, what does it look like to, on a daily basis, trust your partner, trust your fiance, trust your spouse? What does it look like to trust them on a daily basis? Give them the benefit of the doubt. That's something that we all could probably do better with. What does it look like to express your personal commitment to your spouse? And again, these are things like you could also apply this to your friendships. How could you help your friend express your commitment to them as a friend? And it's just all the more important as you're developing a marriage relationship. And then communication. I think oftentimes we have this idea with communication that the point of communication is to understand each other. And while that is definitely important, and you should always strive for more understanding in relationship and your marriage relationship, the point of communication is more so to connect with someone. And it reminds me of prayer. Like prayer, yes, we pray and ask God for things. The biggest purpose of prayer is to be with God. And when you're communicating with your spouse, with your partner, the point is not necessarily to make sure they understand you, or I don't understand you. You just need to talk more, communicate more. And hopefully through prayer and time and continued effort to communicate, you're gonna reach more levels of understanding. But again, we're still learning. We're still figuring it out. And there's still some things about him that I'm I don't understand that. And that's okay. There's freedom in being I don't understand that about you. You're different than me, and that's beautiful and wonderful and exciting and amazing. And I don't think having a 5-hour conversation is necessarily going to help me understand in this certain situation. But I do want to connect with you. And so if you're approaching your relationship when it comes to communication as the point is to connect with my person, rather than the goal is understanding, because I think there's just a lot more freedom if you approach it in that way. So,
yeah, I think this is one of the areas where we see it go awry in culture, where culture puts so much emphasis on whatever word they want to call it, the chemistry or the spark, or where it's just about the romance of it, right? So marriage is relational, and that's good, and it's clearly God intended it to be there, or we wouldn't have those emotions or those feelings or the spark or the desire to hold hands all the way up Rattlesnake Ridge. And I remember even before Maren and I met, and trying to navigate singleness and being and I remember asking some married friends of okay, if you had to have a ratio of the spark ratio to the friendship ratio, because I know some people that are great humans, they're friends, but there's not that spark. What percentage of each do I need here? Am I it's an 80-20 spark to friendship? Is it, what are we talking here? And I think that element of in understanding that relational, the relational dynamic and building that, who do I want to build with when, the reality of the spark is there's seasons in marriage where you don't know whether it's a prolonged season of a health illness or a pregnancy where you take intimacy, sexual intimacy, off the table for seasons of marriage. And whether, again, it could be health, it could be a deployment in the military, you think, and I feel the friendship side of a relationship was talked about so little, but that actually is where you spend a lot of your time. At the end of the day, when I'm having my worst day, or when she's who do I want next to me on my worst day when I'm the least presentable, the least attractive human being, when I'm miserable and my my mom, some family member or something just passed away and I'm reeling in grief, who's the person I want beside me during the unimaginable hard times of life? Or, and vice versa, who do I want to be next to when they're having their, who's going to cling close to me versus push me away when they're in their moment, and who am I going to be able to press in together with in those worst moments? Because the spark doesn't carry through. Spark, and the other side of it is culture talks about spark. Ironically, culture gets the fruit of the way they talk about spark. So they talk about spark as if it's there, but then when it's gone, you move on. Hence, marriages crumble. Marriages in culture don't last long, because if all you're playing to is the spark and thinking that, oh, the lucky ones get married to those people and the spark lasts forever. And then you're oh, how often do you see that? I don't know anybody, but it's out there. It's the infinite spark that just burns with raging lust for the entire marriage and carries them through all the trauma and all the pain. It doesn't exist. you will not find. I mean, I saw the news today, like Ben Affleck and J-Lo are on the rocks again. Like the raging spark fails yet again. I mean, I wish them all the best, but so I think that element of understanding, like, again, what culture's selling you isn't working. And the element of friendship and the element of partnership that's so much of married life is those moments of friendship and partnership and grieving together and laughing together and, parenting together. And of course the spark matters, but the spark is cultivated. And the spark takes commitment, and that is actually easier to cultivate in the context of a strong friendship. But you see it in relationships where it's like, well, man, I'm really attracted to them. And it's like, okay, well, if you took the spark out of the picture, is this the person you'd want to go on a road trip with? And what would you talk about? And it's like, I mean, she's really attractive. Like, if it just comes back to that, like, again, so yeah, I think we obviously that we're not saying the spark's not important. That matters, of course. Again, we wouldn't have held hands all the way up Rattlesnake Ridge without that.
This also kind of removes that excuse or common phrase of like, I just don't love you anymore, or I'm falling out of love. Or even I've heard people say, I love you, but I'm not in love with you. And I think those are just silly. Like, I think those are excuses that I think that we just cling to in moments of weakness when we're not willing to lean into difficult situations, difficult spaces, which is ultimately the most beautiful, profound relationships are the ones where you stay with each other when things are not easy. So, yep.
And then the third area, so marriage is practical, marriage is relational, and marriage is spiritual.
Yeah, so I think this is probably not a shock. Maybe this is where you thought we would start tonight. But ultimately, marriage is about experiencing more of God and becoming more like Him. I think everything in life that God allows us to experience is meant to draw us more closely to Him. And marriage is one of the most beautiful, profound examples that we get to experience this side of heaven of that unconditional love, that fullness of love, the intimacy, the union that we will one day get to have face to face with our Heavenly Father. And so I think that you can't overstate the beauty of that. That marriage as a metaphor is representing that sacrificial love that God intends for us. And hopes for us. And so I think I know we've talked about that idea of over-spiritualizing marriage, but the truth of it is highly spiritual. And I even think about the song we were singing earlier about, Lord, without your presence, there's no meaning. And as believers, I don't know what it looks like to be married to somebody and not having that higher perspective, that higher hope for marriage and redemption. And I even think about, like, in the Christian faith, there are these big words we talk about, justification and sanctification. And justification, it simply just means the moment where you make a decision to follow Jesus. And so that's kind of your initial moment of decision. And sanctification is that daily process of following Him, becoming more like Him, letting Him transform your heart into who He has created you to be and who He wants you to be, which is more like Him. And in a marriage, it's similar. You make that initial commitment, that initial decision to somebody, and then it's a daily decision to continue showing up. It's a daily commitment and it's refining, let me tell you. It is so refining, but there's freedom in it because you have that commitment and that trust. It's such a gift that God gives us to experience the freedom of that, in that commitment, to be vulnerable and to make mistakes and to let God prune away certain things, to sacrifice for somebody, to learn what that looks like and to experience the limitless love of God. Just a glimpse, we see with unveiled faces. Now we see with veiled faces. We don't get to see it fully. But the Bible says that one day we will see face to face. We will understand fully. And so this is just one of those opportunities where we get to get a glimpse, a little taste of what unity with God will be like. And so it is so beautiful. It is so incredible, so profound. I could keep on going, but
yeah, and obviously we can't do like a full, expose on like all of Scripture and marriage. But I think that element of understanding that so much of marriage is about discovering, who God is and how he lays himself. I mean, and again, the parallels are there throughout Scripture of God actually laying himself, and the idea of Christ laying him down, that, he refers to sort of the church as the bride, and he like laying himself down unto death, like giving it all. And that opportunity of sort of that mutual sacrifice to say, wow, we're committed to, like, what does it look like to have somebody that knows you more deeply than anybody else, that's even more committed to your growth than you are to your own discovery. Like, and I think it works when both parties approach it that way, right? Like if one person's like, okay, I've gotten a proposal, like I'll be more committed to me and you be more committed to me, and together we'll be very committed to me, like that, right? Like it just, that would obviously be a very dysfunctional relationship. But when I know that Maren's like deeply committed to like me discovering who God's created me to be and operating in that, and is sacrificing to that end, and then that I'm invited to do the same, to be laying my life down, to be like, Maren, this is what, and we will often do this where we're calling out in each other the things that like maybe we don't have the faith. I mean, we talk about 12 years ago launching Atlas Free, an anti-human trafficking organization. But that was we found out we were pregnant with our first kid when we felt like God was prompting us to do this, to launch a nonprofit. Well, launching a nonprofit is like, just so you know, nobody does that for the money. And like leaving the tech world to take on sex trafficking when you're pregnant with your first kid. And honestly, I would not have had the courage to do it if it wasn't for Maren leaning in and like, along the way, in my lowest moments, in all my vulnerability, be like, I'm terrified to do this. Like, I don't know if I have what it takes to do this. This is daunting. This is scary. And like, we have a kid on the way. And her being able to lean in and press in my moments of weakness. Like, I am who I am today because she's seen something in me that I didn't even see in myself. And I think that's part of the power of having somebody that's committed to that. But that's also daunting because you have to reach a point where you're willing to be that vulnerable. And I think, again, that's the scary thing about what culture has offered, where you're a moment away from the spark going out and that person piecing out because they've fallen out of love, that like you're gonna hold back on that, right? I don't know how you could not hold back on the scarier parts or the lonelier parts or the fearful parts. Because if she saw that thing or saw that insecurity or saw that fear, then maybe she'd be like, oh, whoa, I could do better. And so I think that element of like, certainly my faith and what I've discovered about God's love for us, this becomes the sort of testing ground of how humans, I think one of the primary ways that God put in place for humans to discover that and encounter who he is.
Yeah, so those are our three kind of marriages: practical, marriages relational, marriages spiritual. We also wanted to spend a few minutes just kind of addressing some lies that we hear in culture. And then I know that after this, there will be some time for Q&A, so please feel free to submit those questions. The first question we wanted to just speak to is this idea that there is a one, like I'm waiting for the one. And I think we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I think as believers, we believe that once you have made that decision to follow Jesus, that the Holy Spirit comes and dwells within you and gives you power of discernment, the power of conviction, the power of kind of making decisions, leading. And so we have that agency to make decisions. And so, yes, emotions are God-given, they are good. Marriage is relational, we said that. God wants us to use our hearts and our minds to make a decision. It's a decision. It is, like I said earlier, it's kind of that you have that moment of decision, and then you have a lifetime of everyday decisions. And by the power of the Holy Spirit, he enables us, he equips us, he makes that possible. So this idea that there is only a one, I think that is romanticized in ways that are unhealthy, and kind of, again, it's kind of just leaves an open excuse for piecing out of relationship with people. So.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe the caveat to that is, I guess, certainly God has the freedom for there to be a one. Like, maybe there's situations where, like, God shows up. Maybe some of that's happened to you where, like, the burning bush shows up and, like, you will marry
I would highly
so-and-so, you know.
Seek some accountability, some counsel on that. Like, God told me to marry you. That is like a trump card that should, like, maybe never be played.
And I think for one of the beautiful things about sort of when you feel like you've both made the choice, right? Like, you've chosen that it wasn't just like a mysterious, like the burning bush didn't set it for you, and it's like, hey, you're the one, so I guess this is it. But that deliberate choice and that deliberate commitment to be cultivated over time. I remember for like during our dating, our extensive, long 9-month dating journey. But I remember there was like this point where I was really wrestling, like, how will I know? What do I know? I'm waiting for, like, Lord, give me a sign. And, I was looking for lightning to strike something but I remember there was a point where I kind of had this realization. I was thinking about leaving the country and just all the things I was trying to get in order to move overseas. And I remember as I was like processing all this, I was like, man, I want to talk to Maren on that. I want to get her take on this. Like, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if we could do this together? And I realized, like, that from the friendship standpoint, like, as I was planning out my future, I was just like, man, I want her to be a part of all these discussions. And, like, I need to know what she thinks about this so we can figure out this together. And what if we did, this could be. And I was like, I don't know that the lightning bolt, like, that I'm going to get a lightning bolt, but it was this element of, okay, when it comes to who's the teammate that I want to link arms with to discern, like, what God's up to in my life and in our life and where we're going, that for me was the closest thing I had to sort of that, like, lightning strike. Yeah,
and I think something that was really critical, and this might be practically helpful for any of you guys who are kind of in this season. There was a point where it felt like, okay, there are big linchpins and there are small linchpins. Do you guys know what a linchpin is? Okay.
You got this, or you want me to explain it?
No, I can do it. Okay. A linchpin is like, say you have a pole and it's made of 2 pieces. I'm going to do this. It's made of 2 pieces. There's a linchpin here that holds them so that this one stands upright, it doesn't fall. Or also a grenade, like, right? Is that
like
called a linchpin?
You could, like the pin in a grenade, or
pin
like
in a grenade.
The tiny little pin that holds like
so
an entire
like,
trailer on the back of a pickup truck.
Yeah.
That little
so
pin.
So like the little pin that keeps everything together. That's a linchpin. Anyhow, I'm so glad that there are some of you who don't know what that is. But anyhow. As you are exploring the possibility of making a commitment to somebody, there are some big linchpins that you need to figure out. Like, if that doesn't line up, for instance, if we don't have a shared faith, that's a big linchpin, and so that would, that linchpin would fail. That bomb would blow. There are big linchpins that you should have. And in community, we've talked about that theme of community. It might be helpful to kind of identify, even with your partner, like, what are those big linchpins? Like, these are deal breakers. But then there are small linchpins. And I think so often we get stuck in the, like, well, if they don't do this, then it's not going to work. Or, well, if I can't have this, then that's not going to work. And so I think we impose all of these. I see people like slapping each other. I like it. That's good. Maybe this is resonating. But I think it's just those small linchpins that you just need to get to a point where you're like, they don't matter. Like, I love this person. I want to commit to this person. The big linchpins are sturdy. They're strong. They're set. And all these other little things, like the fact that my husband doesn't like karaoke, that's been like a theme at Reach Church for those of you who don't go there. I like karaoke. He doesn't love karaoke. I like dancing. He doesn't love dancing. And, those things that you're like, well, this is part of who I am. And I don't, I have to marry somebody who's got this. And they just don't matter. In fact, we were not necessarily planning on saying this, but when we got married, I like to say that Jeremy was everything I never knew I always wanted. So a lot of the things that I thought I wanted were not as important when it came down to it. And he had several things that I hadn't even thought of or identified as being important. And so just be open to letting those small linchpins fall away. And then I think it will help you kind of think about the one in a more in a more helpful way.
She actually told me that right before we got engaged. She said, "You're everything I never knew I always wanted." And I paused and I was like, "I'm everything you never knew you never wanted?" Wait, is this a good thing? Hey, 15 years, we're making it work, right?
Yeah, it was a good thing. Okay, next slide is my spouse should complete me. I think another way we have kind of heard this is like, oh, my spouse should make me happy. And well, yes, like we hope that you live in a happy, thriving, flourishing relationship. If you are seeking in your spouse a fulfillment that should be only found in Christ, then you are going to be sorely disappointed. Those expectations are impossible to meet. I think of it as happiness is important, but marriage is more about holiness than it is about happiness. It's about both. And so if you're a math person, maybe you could put like happiness greater than, or no, holiness greater than happiness, if that helps you as a visual. But I think that idea is really dangerous.
Yeah, and I think the idea, in a globalized era where like human beings have never been more transient than they are now, you go back 60 years and like missionaries 60 years ago used to pack their belongings in coffins when they moved overseas to go be missionaries. Because it was like, I'm getting on the boat for a few months and then I'm getting into like the remote and I don't know if I'm ever coming back. And, you go back in time, most of human civilization, again, they tended to live in proximity. And the thing about proximity is it creates an inevitable amount of like community and to some extent accountability. It's like if you live in your town that everybody like multi-generations have grown up, people know you and they know your reputation around town and you're accountable to that. And in an era where people can move around and hop around, it makes it easier to the idea that people think like, oh, well, my spouse can complete me. So even if I don't have other community, like I can get my satisfaction from this person. And I think that's just a lie. And I don't think that's healthy. I mean, people they know that like one of my hobbies is climbing mountains. And people are like, oh, does Maren climb mountains with you? It's like, no, she doesn't. She's actually not that interested. She loves hiking.
I climbed one mountain.
She did do it once.
You should ask that. That's a story for another time.
It's
a
doozy.
Bananas.
We'll just leave that
story.
out there. But, the idea that like you have to have all the same hobbies or you have to like, I think one of the best things that you can offer to a spouse or one of the best things like that you could demonstrate to somebody you're dating or somebody you're engaged to is proof that you're anchored into an accountable community. Because if I show up and you don't know who is around me to keep me in check and I have no proof of relationships and substantive people in my life that like they have shown, there's actually studies, what your parents might have said to you of like, oh, you will act like the average of your 10 closest friends or whatever. That statement, that's actually been demonstrated in psychology is like your success and your trajectory is the average of the 5 to 8 people you spend the most time with. And so if you're dating somebody or engaged to somebody and you don't know who the 5 to 7 people are that they spend the most time with, that's a huge problem. Or if you look at the 5 to 7 people and you're like, everybody they hang out with is a disaster. And they're narcissists and they hate everybody. But this person's really hot or whatever. You know exactly what you're walking into, like fair warning. And so one of the best things you can offer is this sense of like, Maren doesn't have to be everything for me. In fact, some of what enables me to show up is like, I'm going to count on some of my friends, and many of them are at reach, that like, if I'm losing perspective on something or if I'm being really selfish in a season, they're going to be the ones that it's really hard sometimes as a spouse. If Maren were to be like, hey, Jer, I don't feel like you're really factoring me into the equation right now? Like she can say that to me, but I might hear that differently from one of my best friends. It's like, dude, you're being selfish right now. Like, are you really laying down your life to serve Maren right now in this decision? Or how have you included her in this? Or, I can hear that differently. And so one of the reasons why I think it's important to understand that is like, if you try to get that out of one person, they will fail you. To understand that like God designed us for community. And so building community, and that's why, again, things like this exist. And Reach goes to great lengths to try to facilitate the opportunity to be in community with like-minded people who are going to sharpen you and pour into you. And that is something, if you're wondering, like, should I get engaged to the person that I'm with? Or like, wow, engagement's different than I thought. Like, look at the people that they've surrounded themselves with, because that's your helpline. If things get difficult, like Maren knows the list of people she can call. If you feel like, babe, if we're having a hard time, and we've done this before where we're having a rocky spot on like, man, we're driving each other a little bit bonkers when we're trying to get through this conversation and we're just not seeing eye to eye. And we'll pull out the list like, okay, who do we want to call? Like, let's go sit down with them and see and go in and be like, hey, fair game. Either one, you can call either one of us or both of us out. Like, I'm willing to put it on the table. And if I'm the one that's, and we've had friends do that for us as well. Say, hey, we're just frustrated right now and we're not seeing eye to eye. Like, will you guys walk through this with us? But that was really important for us to know, like, who are those people that we can call on, because we can't be everything for each other at all times.
Yeah. So just maybe ask each other, where do you go to find your satisfaction, your sense of fulfillment, and who informs your identity? And if you're not surrounding yourself with, or if the answers are not people who point you to Jesus or just Jesus, then that might be something that you need to work through. I think that becomes idolatry. There is a point where it becomes idolatry. We have some more, but I think
it's time for Q&A.
I know I want to give time for Q&A. So we have some other lies, but maybe we'll transition to Q&A. And maybe some of the Q&A are some of the lies that we had.
No, we have quite a bit of questions. Y'all did good this time. So just make sure, if you haven't gone to look at the questions yet, just go and upvote the ones that you really want to hear. We'll try to just get through as many as possible. There'll be a little bit quicker answers, but also, like, again, if you guys have lots of things to say, we want to hear it. So it looks like the first one that we have for you are, what are practical ways you still prioritize your relationship with Jesus individually and as a married couple?
One of the surprises, I think, for me in marriage was, we grew up in like 90s purity culture, if you guys even know what that is. But
like, we all got purity rings and signed purity pledges in youth group. And
you're told, like, when you get married, you're going to like spend 2 hours every morning praying together and having a Bible study. And so I think as much as God spoke truth into some of those lies, as we were beginning our relationship and getting married, I think there were still some unrealistic expectations of what coming together spiritually meant. And I remember, so I would say, just to answer that question quickly, I think it's both and. I think primarily we probably spend more time individually in personal quiet time, reading scripture, studying the word, prayer, than we do together. But we do also get to do it together as well, which is wonderful and beautiful. And I think at first it was a little awkward. Like, I'd be in the car and I'd be like, oh, I feel compelled to pray. And if I were by myself in the car, I would just pray. And then now suddenly there's a guy in my car and I'm like, I'm going to pray right now, which, it's like, it's awkward until it's not. So you just figure out some rhythms that are important to you, and they might feel a little forced at first, but eventually they won't feel forced, and they'll just work for you.
Absolutely. All right, the next one is, what is the goal of engagement, and what is the best use of this time?
I love that question. And I would actually pose a question back. I would.
Who's going to answer it?
It's rhetorical. No, where you can ask each other. I think that the question is, what might God have to teach me in this season? and specifically, I think of like, what are areas where we can exhibit self-control, not just physically, but also emotionally, financially. You're obviously kind of thinking through, like, do we live together? Do we not live together? What are areas of self-control, of withholding in this season that God might allow in the next season to be that much more satisfying because we have withheld, we have had self-control in this season of engagement? I think you might be surprised. I think you might be surprised at the discipline that he grows in you that is going to be so critical in your married life, because the truth of the matter is temptation doesn't go away. And not just physical temptation, but the temptation to be selfish, the temptation to just seek pleasure in all things and just do what you want. Your schedule will ultimately be so intertwined. There are going to be inconveniences about it. And so I think just preparing for that, I think asking, how can God teach me in this season of withholding, of self-control, that could set us up for a more beautiful future season.
Yeah, engagement, I think, is a little interesting in that, like, the Bible doesn't really lay out a lot about, like, what is a timeline of engagement, and so it is an area where I think we have to exercise discernment. And so you have, like, practical elements of engagement of, like, well, we got to get engaged so then it's official so we can plan the wedding, and how long does it take? But I think, to Maren's point, one of the things I've seen with engagement that I think is a beautiful picture, and maybe first I'll add the comment about the idea of, like, temptation. I've gone head to head with a lot of friends because a lot of Christians talk about engagement like, oh, that's like your hall pass period because you're kind of committed, so that's when you can, like, really get after it. Fill in the blank what that means. But I would submit that the person that you're engaged to is going to exercise in marriage the same level of self-control as in engagement. And so I boldly challenge my friends. Now, I fight sex trafficking for a living, so I talk about sex, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, porn for a living, like at coffee shops with people all the time. So, like, I'm wildly comfortable to talk about this stuff. I know this isn't culturally the normative anymore. We grew up in a context where, like, people talked a lot about, like, sex being made for the context of marriage, and that's not culturally normative. Again, I invite you to weigh how that's working for culture. But I have a lot of friends that are like, that believe, like, well, no, we don't want to, like, I'm not going to have sex with just every girl I would casually date, but once I'm engaged, we're pretty much married. And I push back on that thinking because, one, you're not married, you're engaged and you're working towards marriage, and Scripture certainly does not distinguish between active sexual relationship with somebody and then marriage as, like, oh, marriage is that thing where you have a ceremony and sign a paper with the state of Washington. That's biblical marriage. All the other stuff is, like, no, and Scripture doesn't make that distinction. But part of it, at a spiritual level, what I think is so beautiful about engagement is I think it's actually one of the most compelling seasons of painting the picture for what it's like to follow Jesus on earth.
Of waiting and longing.
Yeah, of this idea that, like, Scripture is very clear that we are in this space as followers of Jesus where we're no longer citizens of this earth, and there is this coming kingdom where there is no more tears, where there's no more suffering, where there's no more human trafficking, where all things are made new, and we are invited to this bigger kingdom of what it means to be committed to human flourishing, where we leave our sin and brokenness and shame behind. And we're supposed to long for that. But the hard part is, and many Christians throughout the world have longed for that because they lived in such a desperate state of suffering. The challenge is we live in one of the most prosperous zip codes in one of the most prosperous times in the history of the world. And it's really easy to get comfortable and be like, actually, God, we're good. Like, I like living on the east side and the summer weather's about to hit. Like, take your time. This is great. And we don't live with that sense of longing. And I think engagement is this beautiful picture of, like, I am madly in love with this person. We've already said that we're going to be committed to each other, but we're not there yet. We're in this in-between, but man, I just, like, physically I want to be with this person and I'm longing for this, but I'm going to, like, hold for what this thing is that is coming and long for this coming day and then embrace the beauty of that coming day, like, it is this picture of the way that we as followers of Jesus should long for the kingdom come. Jesus, like, I can't wait for when again, I live in this space of like dealing with the worst forms of human suffering. Like, I long for the day when there are no more children born into brothels whose only experience with men are pimps and pedophiles. Like, Jesus, I long for that day, but it's not yet here. And so I will fight tooth and nail and do what it takes until that day comes. And engagement is actually one of the only experiences that you have in life to sort of press into that sense of pent-up longing, but exercising that self-control and restraint.
Yeah, it is such a unique, specific, it's one of the only times. Yeah. So don't squander it. Yeah.
And don't resent it. Like, let that be beautiful. Like, that longing, God created that longing. Embrace the beauty of it and cherish for what it is.
Absolutely. I think that's like a real,
and don't
really
be engaged for like 6 years. That's stupid.
No, that's like a very good perspective shift there, right? And our next question is kind of on that same topic with boundaries of where do you draw the line and what intimacy is too far, and how do you backtrack on intimate things if both parties aren't feeling convicted to do so?
Yeah. I love this question. This was like the question growing up, and it was always through the lens of like, how much can we do? And like, I'm going to ask around, and then I'm going to hold on to the one that's like, oh, he moved the boundary a little further. Yep, I like that one. Okay, and then I'm going to ask another 20. Oh, we got a little bit further. Yep, I'm taking that boundary. And I think you miss the point when you're doing that. Is what are you actually fighting for? Like, what's the end goal? Like, is the goal to have as many relationships along the way where you've pushed the boundary as far as possible to get as many variety of experiences? Like, I think most of you would probably say, well, that doesn't sound that meaningful. Like, that doesn't sound like the aim of my life would be to like push the boundary with as many people as possible to sort of discover. It's like, what are we aiming for first and foremost as the goal? And I would say in some of like that idea of like the end game, if you're dating, drawing lines, just wrestling with that question, if the end game is a committed relationship, which again, we're coming from a biblical worldview. So I had somebody ask me like my philosophy on ethical non-monogamy. So like we're in an era where culture, we can't assume that culture cares about like a committed relationship. But like for us, where we're saying we believe that the end goal for human flourishing is a committed relationship of people mutually committed before God to each other and to each other's flourishing, to serving each other, sacrificing for, if that's the end goal, then draw your boundaries backwards from there. Like, if you're with the person that you don't know is that person, like, and that person is still out there, like, and Jesus is trying to carve out a space where, like, his goal for us is to preserve in us that space that we're not out there just spreading ourselves so thin and trying to like, okay, the best way to do that is like, I'm going to connect with as many people as possible. And again, in the world's view, that's the view, is like have sex with as many people as possible and then see which one fits the best. Like, where's the spark the highest? Again, it's not working. And so it's not a list of like shame and judgment of like, ooh, this is when God like has a problem with you. And you're gonna, ooh, like then you're really like, you're cursed here or your relationship is doomed there. I think it's really starting from that place of like, what are we aiming for? And how do we point ourselves and orient ourselves around that? And some of that is the element of self-control. Like, is setting boundaries that align with what you're aiming for and then doing it. And I mean, we're in an era where like, again, I live in a world where people make excuses because they get busted for trying to buy sex from a kid. And then they're like, well, I didn't know, I didn't do like, so as you can imagine, I don't have a lot of tolerance for people with no sexual self-control because I see the extreme manifestation of that. And so and yet I know it's a real thing. Like, of course, like it takes, and we're not gonna be perfect and we're gonna make mistakes and we have to, but like the extreme end of it does have real consequences. And too often, even in the Christian context, especially men, will talk about it as like, oh, well, we all give in to temptation. I'm like, okay, well, where do you say that to the guy who's buying a child? Do you just say, oh, well, we all give in to temptation? No, like put the guy in prison. Like we draw hard lines. And in life, when you get married, that stuff doesn't go away. In fact, I have had a sex drive for more time married than I did single, right? Like my percentage of time from whenever I hit puberty to when I got married is a shorter amount of time that from when my sex drive activated up till marriage after. So you're going to have to wrestle with this and exercise self-control the rest of your life. And so if you're redefining your boundaries, not based on your beliefs about the goal that you want to live and the life God's called you to live, but if you're redefining them in the heat of passion, you're going to keep doing it. Like, find the accountability, find the commitment, talk to the people, wrestle through why is that happening. I'm not heaping shame. Don't go hide in a corner and be like, oh, I'm a terrible person. No, deal with it, because you can. And you can live it, let God transform you, because the way you live now, the way you justify failing on sexual temptation now, you will continue. I see it all the time. The patterns you set now are not going away with marriage. It's not a magic bullet that radically, narrows in your sex drive, that suddenly all attraction is honed in on one person. I'll never be tempted to look at anybody else. Like, no, absolutely not. So the patterns you set now are the patterns you will carry. So change them. Set your goals based not on the world, but based on what you believe God's calling you to in Scripture, and do it.
Yep, that's good. I have nothing to add.
Yeah. No, great. Thank you for that.
Exactly what he said.
Yeah. What topics should be discussed before choosing to get engaged?
Ooh.
Well, we kind of talked about the big linchpins, small linchpins thing, and so I think that will probably vary from person to person. So identifying what are the deal breaker questions, what are the deal breaker, like, do you want to have children? That's a very big linchpin that should probably be included in that. But I think a question that Jeremy mentioned earlier, would you want to be with this person on your worst day? Would you want this person to be with you on your worst day? Can this person handle you in your weakest moments? Can you handle that person in their weakest moments? So I think questions like that, not everybody is great at thinking of questions or like taking it deeper. Because obviously you can all ask like, well, where do you want to live? And how many kids do you want to have? And like some of those like more obvious questions. If you don't have good questions to ask, you probably have friends who are really good at asking questions that help you to get to some of those deeper lying issues. I brought this, if anybody is interested in looking at it afterwards. I love questions. I'm a very curious person, and I love asking questions. I love being asked good questions. But these are literally cards that just have good questions on them. You can buy this. So if you are wondering what kinds of questions to ask to get to more intimate kind of depth with your partner, with your boyfriend, girlfriend, and even in marriage, I think it's sometimes easier for some people to connect ongoing, because once you're married, obviously you want to continue to connect in deep ways and continue to get to know each other. These kinds of resources are available, and they're not stupid. Like, this is actually, they did a really nice job of putting together thoughtful questions that can help prompt really good discussion.
I think, and if you're at that point where you're like in a dating relationship thinking about engagement, I think, and you'll hear from the marriage mentor team too, like in the context of community, I don't think there's anything wrong. Like when we were pretty pragmatic about like, hey, we're spending a lot of time, like, where's this going? And what are the things we're wrestling through? And having some couples in the context of a church that are older to be like, hey, could we get together? And like, we'd love for you to just get to know us. And like, we're really trying to discern where this relationship is going. I don't think that needs to be a weird, that like, hopefully if you're in the context of Christian community, the assumption should be like, if we're pursuing romantic relationship, it's not just to ease Friday night loneliness, right? Like it's towards an end. Now, that doesn't mean you have to figure that out tomorrow. Like, we just had our first coffee date. Like, I'm looking for a spouse. Are you the one? But
I've been on interrogation dates before. Don't do that.
Not with me.
Not with Jeremy. No, others.
Yeah, but lean into the community. Even approach the, not sense buried, but lean into even the marriage mentors and say, hey, is there somebody, we're getting pretty serious in our relationship. Is there somebody that we could meet with? That there's some tools that the marriage mentor ministry has, and So.
Okay, that's great. Okay, we're gonna do just two more. But what are practical things to do to protect your marriage and invest in your partner?
One thing I think we've kind of talked about this, avoiding temptation and temptation carrying into marriage. One thing that has been important for us, a couple things. Proactively protect your marriage by avoiding temptations altogether. So Jeremy travels a lot for work, and I think I came into marriage naively thinking like, oh yeah, you can like be around other women like when you're traveling, and I'm not a jealous person, and I trust you, and obviously I do, and he is a man of integrity. However, it was important to him from the beginning, like I will not ride in the same vehicle alone with another woman. I will not be spending time communicating one-on-one with a woman. I will not, if I'm traveling with a colleague from work, we won't even stay at the same hotel. But just he totally led the way in this. And I think that it's easy for us to think, oh, that would never happen to us. Like you hear about people going through things, having affairs. That would never happen to us. We're not like that. And the truth of the matter is we are all susceptible. Everyone in this room is capable of a moment of weakness. And so if you are not proactively taking steps to protect your relationship, protect your marriage, then you're leaving yourself vulnerable to that moment of weakness. And so that was something. Another thing that we fiercely committed to was honoring each other with our speech. And so that goes both like when we're talking to each other and not being sarcastic with one another. I know sometimes people, that's just how they flirt. But I would challenge you, like, do you find when you are being sarcastic with your person that they might not respond well, or maybe that was over the line, and do you know the line of what's too much sarcasm and what's not? So we just kind of removed most sarcasm from our communication, and really challenged each other to speak with honor to one another, and then especially to anyone else. So Jeremy mentioned, we have like a short list of friends that we can call who are like, we've agreed upon these people. These are our people where if we need to kind of vent and work through something, we know these are agreed upon, trusted individuals who are going to point us to Jesus and to each other. It's not like, oh, I just need to go out with my girls and vent, and they're all going to be like, oh, he's terrible, and like, what a guy, like, he's so awful. I'm not very good at this because clearly I'm not well practiced, but I think we're in that culture of like, you're like, oh, I'm annoyed with you. I just need to go out with my dudes, or I need to go out with my girls and vent. And who is that serving? Especially if they're reinforcing your frustration, like that is not helpful at all. And so just being really honoring each other, I remember actually the first time this came up, Jeremy and I were at a friend's house, actually the couple who set us up. We were playing a game, and I don't remember what game it was, but he just totally messed me up. Like he came after me in this game, and I was like, oh, I hate you. And I said it totally trying to just be playful and silly. And afterwards, he like made a big deal about it, and I was like, you are very dramatic and sensitive. However, I came to appreciate and see the importance of not even in that setting, because then it's like, well, does that couple know that I was just joking when I said that? Did they think there was like an underlying like jab there? And so just removing any of that, above reproach, that idea of just being above reproach and how you talk to each other and about each other.
And there is in culture, like, the phrase misery loves company. Like, again, if in culture most marriages are breaking down, those people love to get together and talk about how terrible their spouses are, or how miserable their marriage are, or like to find company there. And so just refusing to participate, to be like, again, our marriage is going to have points where we need help, and we'll go to those people, but we're not just going to go and vent and look for that place to be like, oh yeah, you wouldn't believe what Maren did yesterday.
Yeah, and I think even beyond that, like obviously don't complain or vent, speak well of each other. Jeremy, I admire him and respect him for so many things. And so you will have so many opportunities to honor your spouse, honor your partner, honor your fiance in speaking highly about them. And I think that also is a fun thing to do too, because you're able to kind of brag on them for things that they wouldn't necessarily say.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Okay, last question. What were ways that you built your trust, and how do you nurture that?
That's a good question.
Yeah, we tend to be pretty honest and vulnerable with each other. I mean, I realized really early on how, like, one, Maren is incredibly intelligent, and she's also like a very determined person who can carry a lot. And so I think for me, that was one of the things I was scared from a relational standpoint. Again, growing up in a context where it's like, you got to know how to just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and get it done, and you got to be a great leader. And finding that space, like especially early on, I felt like it was toe in the water of like, hey, I don't really know what to do here. How do you feel about that? And just seeing the way like her press in to be like, yeah, we got this. Like, let's figure this out together. And being like, okay, well, what about this? What if I don't know how to do this? Like, and so finding that, really giving your spouse the opportunity to be strong for you and with you and alongside of you, and being vulnerable. While at the same time, I think we often talk about the difference between integrity and authenticity. I think our culture values authenticity and doesn't value integrity. And I would define those as integrity is doing the right thing despite how you feel, and authenticity is being what you feel.
Doing what you feel. Yeah.
And our culture is sort of like, no, you just have to be everything you feel, you have to express that. And it's like, there's a lot of days I shouldn't say everything that's on my mind. Like, there are days where I'm like, I might be frustrated because I'm mad. I might be having a bad day, and so everything Maren does might irritate me that day. And if I were just like, you're irritating, you're this, you're that, like, I have to be like, man, I'm having a selfish attitude today, and I need to speak from the place and treat Maren from the place of like, what is the right way to treat my wife, not what's authentic to how I feel because I had a rough day at work yesterday, or I heard some really heavy news and I feel like, and again, our society says, no, that's inauthentic. Like, if that's not how you feel, you got to be true to yourself. I'm like, yeah.
Yeah. And I think along kind of piggybacking off of that, marriage is a very unique, probably one of a kind opportunity to vulnerably associate yourself with another person. And I think that as you get to know each other and communicate to each other, like in that situation I just mentioned about when I said, oh, I hate you, and he was like, hey, afterward. He didn't do it in the moment. He did it afterwards. He had that, he addressed that kind of harder issue, and I had to choose not to be defensive in that moment. I think one of the things is that your reputation is now linked as a married couple. And so when you demonstrate that you can be trusted to honor each other, to speak highly of each other, if you can trust that they're going to carry your reputation well, and that you can share something like, hey, I know this might not feel like authentic to who you are, but it's important to me that we don't, maybe talk about this, or that you tell people, share this story, that you carry that with a lot of intention and care. I think when you demonstrate your ability to do that, I think that creates so much trust, because it's a really vulnerable thing to have your identity, your reputation now closely associated with another person. And there have been times where, Jeremy does something and I'm like, I don't necessarily feel that same way, but I am his spouse, and I'm going to stand with him. I'm not going to disagree with him in this moment. That's not going to be helpful or edifying. And I think those are the moments where it's like, wow, you had my back, and I can trust you. And so I think...
And then she'll let me know later that she disagreed.
Yeah, yeah.
Of course. Well, thank you both so much tonight for just sharing with us and being vulnerable. And I feel like we have a lot to unpack with that. So thank you so much. You all give them a hand for just being here.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. All right. So we're